There was one every
That
month.
was such an amazing show.
That's potent.
Like they had us in the corner,
Man.
and then there was the main stage, and then there was a cage with a pole, and
I've seen these bands.
Manch Records.
Yeah.
Manch.
That's the fucking real shit right there. The caves, JC's, oh yeah, the fucking Elks Lodge. That was another place that you had to go for shows.
There was.
The attic, of course.
Yeah. These are, man, I mean, just a bunch of shit.
We almost had our own Lollapalooza of our scene.
It's true.
It's so sad it fell through.
In the early 90s, the center of the cultural scene of Las Vegas was really university focused. It really was coffee houses and bars, and that's where the energy was. Those were where all the music venues were.
Anything cultural was on Maryland Parkway for a long time. I think because its proximity to the campus, but back then it was pretty much the center of town.
Maryland Parkway was the center of commerce. It's city planning 101. This is where you put your hospital. This is where there's the big movie theater. This is where there's the university. This is where the airport is located, and all the restaurants and businesses in between.
Maryland Parkway was the backbone for the whole incipient art scene.
You had some great record stores, the best in the city. You had the radio station and the culture surrounding that. And then the anchor to all of it were the cafes.
We had a wealth of coffee houses and artists and poets and musicians all being engaged at the same time.
There was constantly good music and poetry and just interesting things happening.
We all had a scene. Like everybody knew each other, and we'd pull other people in.
It blossomed because there was kind of a social movement. There was a lot of things that were sort of coalescing that made the early 90s feel a little bit like the late 60s.
The cultures were starting to come together, and there was a real openness to that within our community.
There was that whole blending of that punk DIY, do-it-yourself ethic, that whole bohemian, we're going to do it, we're going to hang it out there, and we're going to dance, and we're going to have fun with it.
It was the hub of anything that was happening that was underground, that was creative, it was exciting.
We were challenging what was basically a notion that everything happened on the Strip, that all the art happened on the Strip, that all the entertainment was on the Strip.
It helped me to know that there were other people who were creating, who had a place in Las Vegas, where they had an outlet.
And so it really became this sort of thoroughfare of easy space, and people would find their niche.
We were in this together, and we were just trying to make something happen and make it work. And it did for a while.
Culture in Vegas in the late 80s, early 90s was lacking, perhaps, unless you knew where to look. You had to really dig for it. If you knew people in bands, you could find some culture. If you went out to the gigs in the desert with a generator and a couple bands, beyond that, it was pretty lacking.
People don't realize just how small Vegas was just that short time ago. It was huge swaths of just desert.
So when I left Las Vegas in 1984, there really wasn't live venues for original music. There was, I think, maybe Moby Grapes that was on Tropicana, And that was, of course, that was more of like a bar that had live music. But other than that, I mean, to see live music was really go to a lounge on the Strip. There really wasn't venues for live music then.
I grew up here in the 1980s in Las Vegas, and it lived up to the phrase cultural wasteland, at least from my perspective. In the 80s, if you wanted, art or culture, you got in your car and you drove to LA if you grew up in Vegas. There was no place to do things. There were no venues. There was no cultural infrastructure.
I'm from Vegas. I grew up in Boulder City, and I went to UNLV. When I started in 1985, there was really nothing going on Maryland Parkway. There was no decent coffee shops.
In 1986, I believe, I opened up the newsroom on Las Vegas Boulevard at Carson, right down the street from the Hair Zoo, which ostensibly was a hairstyling place, but was actually a center for all kinds of weirdness and music and art. My place had a different focus, focusing on coffee and literature and chess and history and stuff like that.
So yeah, the newsroom was a place where people could come in the morning, mostly downtown casino workers. You'd have all sorts of odd people come in because it was an international newsstand and some word would get out.
A friend of mine and I like to go out and hang out there, and then it was kind of fun to go downtown, and the way the newsroom downtown was set up, it was really kind of small and lots of different newspapers from all over the world, magazines and so on and so forth.
It was what I wanted. It's what I'd seen in traveling. These places where people would just come together and drink coffee and talk and laugh and play games, and there wasn't anything like that in Las Vegas. The first day we opened, we were busy as we could be, and it stayed that way for a long time, until the time where we were faced with eviction for demolition purposes. We chose the university area because it seemed kind of silly not to. We were able to get storefronts in newer buildings. We ended up in the arcade building with the big holes in it that looks out across Maryland Parkway to the music school.
They had gotten a reasonable deal on a good place to be. They figured the university area was more conducive to expanding their business. They wanted to actually have a kitchen with a menu.
It immediately changed the feeling of the newsroom, because most of the guys who were in there playing chess all the time, lived downtown. We suddenly had many more kids. So a lot of college students, a lot of high school students, a lot of goths.
We lived in an apartment right behind the newsroom, really bad apartment complex. So we would jaywalk across the street in the middle of class, we'd get tired painting, whatever. And professors would come with us and we'd walk down and get coffees at the newsroom.
I remember ditching school and going there one time and thinking how much it felt like an actual city right there. And just kind of, getting a funky vibe from it. Like, people were hanging out and like it was students and what I, assumed to be artists.
The art department was a huge part of what was going on in the coffee. I had an art show in the newsroom. We had art shows there. So we had the poetry stuff going on and the art stuff there. But the art department was a big part of that because we were right there on Maryland Parkway, part of the whole scene there. Like I had a show at the newsroom because there was really nowhere to show, and the gallery on campus was usually reserved for either graduate students or visiting artists.
After a really great 6 months, lots of live music, jazz, classical, lots of great art. My partner at the time got very sick, and we had to leave. I had to take him home because he was going to die, and he wanted to die at the home that he grew up at in Vermont. My business partner, John Lobb, who had gone to high school with, got married, and his wife did not really approve of the newsroom. She did not like him spending time, money, nothing. Brian Weiss was made the manager, And he tried. But in the end, by the time I got back, it was pretty much done.
After Lynn Adams left, the newsroom very quickly fell apart and eventually closed. And the space was taken over by Bad News Cafe. It was a dirtier, seedier version of exactly what we'd had there before without the cultural influence. It was just a guy trying to sell coffee to university students and make a buck. And he was absolutely using the fact that he was in a space that had once been a cultural center to his advantage.
My first experience with Maryland Parkway would be the Record Exchange, which later became Underground Records. And Wayne Coyner and Louis Thomas, when he was a kid, he was working there. I met the legendary Stardust Cowboy there. I did art shows there. We're talking mid-'80s, mid to late 80s, where the very first art show I was in was at this little record store that was the punk rock mecca. It was the only thing like we had it in Las Vegas. And I remember the very first time I walked in there, and I'm still in high school. And I'm looking at the walls, and there's a big DOA poster and Dead Kennedys. I'm like, should I be in here? Because I'm listening to AC/DC and Ted Nugent or whatever. And so that would be the first time I was really aware of what the cool side of what Maryland Parkway was about to be or become. But it was really just there.
Back in the early 90s, I'd go peek in the underground and check out the records. I'd buy a couple tapes, and I remember seeing some of the interesting looking people there.
I was about 15 when I first really clued into Maryland Parkway. When I discovered the underground, I would beg my mom to take me down there as much as she would suffer through it, where I would pick up the greatest punk and garage and goth and psychobilly, the greatest underground stuff you could find in the city.
When you put out a cassette or vinyl, which we did back then, put out a little record or whatever, and you borrow money from your parents or other people's parents and put this record out, and now you got to sell it. Well, you're not going to sell it to Tower Records, but you'll sell it to the Record Exchange or Underground because they would support local bands.
I would visit with Wayne from the Underground. He and I shared an interest in old postcards, and there came a moment when we both thought that there was a particular card relating to atom bombs that was the most extraordinary postcard ever, and that was a reason for me to go use a color copier for the first time, which led to 10 plus years of my engagement with the possibilities of making collages with color copiers. The inception of that notion was conversations held over the counter with like-minded people, and that's what the Underground, that's the function it served all across the city, was as a node for people to engage in conversations about common interests.
We would hear the song of a band like the Dead Kennedys. We'd rush over. If they didn't have it at Underground, you got in Maximum Rock and Roll, and there's ordering in the back, and you had to order these things. That's how we got our Doc Martens. It's how we got our music. But you heard these bands first on KUNV.
91.5 KUNV Las Vegas on the left of the FM dial. It's a community radio station run by the faculty of UNLV and by students, mostly, at least in theory.
So I discovered KUNV while in high school, looking for good music on the radio. It was the only place as you're scanning through the dial where suddenly the Misfits would jump out at you, or NWA, or crazy jazz that you just weren't hearing anywhere else. One of the things that really cemented my love affair with KUNV was Rock Avenue.
And Rock Avenue was the programming that happened at night every evening that was punk and new wave, generally, music.
Started up around 8 o'clock at night and went to the wee hours of the morning.
I had really great seats to see Def Leppard at the time, and I discovered KUNV, and within 2 weeks I had sold my tickets to Def Leppard and bought tickets to see Missing Persons at Artemis Ham Hall. So it really kind of changed my musical direction at a very impressionable time because I was in high school, and it became kind of the go-to for the Vegas portion of the underground alternative punk new wave scene, because there was nowhere else to hear that music.
Rock Avenue played things that no other radio station even came near. To hear Minor Threat and Husker Du and Space Hog, maybe back to back, literally. I mean, come on, where do you get that?
The very first time I heard the Dead Kennedys, the very first time I heard Public Enemy was 7 in the morning on the Rock Avenue at KUNV. We used to take a cassette recorder. I'd get a 90-minute cassette, the longest I could, and I'd just hit record, and then go back and listen to it the next day in my truck as I was on my way to work and discover all these new bands and stuff. So it's funny, I've never talked about that ever in my entire life, how important that was.
And now KUNV's Rock Avenue has become one of the nation's best, if not the best, college radio programming. They won the Gavin Award for the top radio programming. And so much of the Vegas culture is centered around that. I mean, it was almost like the DJs had become stars. People would go up there and take them lunch or take them dinner just to hang out and listen to what they were going to play next. And they were students, which made it really accessible.
They were real music fans. They were kids. They weren't getting paid. They were doing this because they loved music. They weren't the highly compressed, EQ'd DJ personas of the mainstream radio channels. These were kids just like me, like the gang I hung out with, people I was in bands with, that did this 100% for the music.
I remember the very first time I heard my band on KUNV. I'm driving to work. I pulled over because I didn't have a cell phone because it's 87 or whatever, and called up Anthony Hudak and I said, dude, listen to the radio, they're playing this on the radio, they're playing this on the radio. By the time he turned it on, it was gone.
I was already finding great music through things like Flipside Magazine and Maximum Rock and Roll, and then KUNV completed the picture because that was a sea of people who were looking to explore beyond what traditional mainstream radio was providing. And the things they would turn me on to, I would then go down to Benway Bop and ask Ronn and Kelly, okay, I love this, what else do I need to hear?
Benway Bop was a record store run by Ronn Benway and Kelly Green.
We basically opened this store on about $10,000 in product and $10,000 in cash that we borrowed from my dad, and just set up on Maryland Parkway.
He was determined to get a place on Maryland Parkway. His mom lived right down the street. He remembered that from his high school days, and he would go to the mall on Maryland and Twain.
I bought my very first 8-track tape in a store that was in that same mall. So that mall was really important to me. Like the Tower Records was the next mall over. I grew up in that Tower Records. Tower was incredible, the displays were incredible, and I was just like, this is what I want to do with my life.
We did our little research for when we got the loan and the demographics of the area and, college over here, and there's a radio station over there. And it did help a bit. Sean Jones did all of our artwork, did our amazing flyers. And we handed out flyers, we went to bars, we handed out flyers, we went to schools, handed out flyers, we posted them all over UNLV. People would come over and say, hey, when are you opening? It was very exciting, and it was very motivating. I would hate it if we were sitting there building a record store and nobody came by to find out what the deal was. But we had a good response, and from day one, we did okay.
We set up, and kids were banging on our door, before we even opened, and asking for music. Can you get me this? Can you get me that? And I was like, I can get you this, I can get you that. I went to high school with Ronn Benway. I went to 6th grade with Ronn Benway. Ronn Benway and I were best friends in 6th grade. In high school, we were acquainted. He was in the band and hung out with the band kids and at the band table in the cafeteria at Valley High School. So I was welcomed at the band table, but was not necessarily invited. It was Figler, it was Chad Reynolds, it was Crosby, it was Sean Jones, it was me. And I was older than everybody else. So I was kind of the ruler of the nerd table in a weird way. They were all really into sci-fi, and I wasn't so into sci-fi. I was into the Ramones. We all found out about the Ramones together. So this would have been summer '91, and I walked in, and the guy behind the counter goes, hey, David. I go, hey, Ron. So that was kind of cool. People who I grew up with would walk in the record store and say, this looks like your bedroom when you were 17. And I was like, that's what I want here. I want a living room. I want a couch in back. I want this to be a comfortable haven for kids who have nowhere to go, because I grew up as a kid who had nowhere to go here.
I was still in high school when I first went to Benway Bop, but I was looking through the records, just checking the place out, and then I heard a familiar voice. It was my friend Bill Hooper that I was going to high school with at Valley. I was talking with Bill, and I met the owner, Ronn Benway, and I was just getting into this whole scene. It was a very colorful place. Ronn Benway had a very good sense of humor, and was just kind of a fun, welcoming guy to interact with. So sometimes just going to that record store, even if you weren't buying anything, it was just a fun experience. You get to hear about something cool that you've never heard before, like Ween.
Benway was slightly more than a record store. I mean, it had to be, because all we had coming in from the outside world in terms of, independent music was Benway Bop and Rock Avenue, KUNV. So if you had a question about something, if there was a band you needed, Ronn was the hookup.
I really consider myself like an indie rock cheerleader of sorts. Like kids would be in my store shopping in Benway Records, shop Benway Bop, whatever, shopping around. A big part of why we set up was because KUNV was across the street. We knew there was records. We knew there were people interested in music.
Rock Avenue led to, me going to Benway Bop. I'd hear something on the Rock Avenue and go, oh, this is good. And I'd actually write it down and go to the Benway Bop and find it.
A lot of times there was no venue for anyone to play. Like when Cub first came through town, they were lost. They didn't know where to play. They didn't know what to do here. And we'd just take them under our wing and go, hey, come on, come play in our store. And there was always trouble from the stakeout next door with in-stores or whatever it was. If we were too loud and they couldn't hear their sports scores on the other side of the wall, there was always trouble there.
Every time I went to Benway, there was always a crowd there. I would walk out of that shop with something that I had no idea I was going to. I didn't go there looking for something, but I always went there and found something. Let's put it that way.
After Bad News closed, Cafe Espresso Roma opened in the same place, and that was a considerably more legitimate coffee organization. They were a chain. They decided it was a good location across from the university, and they had the means and the experience to actually turn it into a legitimate coffee house. And it became a real focal point in the university, and something I think they just filled the niche at the right time.
I was looking specifically for open mic poetry places that would let me do my brand of non-poetry poetry, which was just designed for laughs. And I found one right away. They were doing open mic poetry. There was an old burnt out hippie dude named John Emmons who was in charge of it.
Poetry Alive was a poetry reading hosted by John Emmons for at least 4 or 5 years, every Thursday night.
I played the same room in Vegas for 5 years, every Thursday night.
At Roma, I believe something like 4 or 5 poets decided it's time to have a poetry reading.
It was three or four people sitting around the table, reading their poetry to each other. We were also in competition with the local chess club.
Because who do chess players typically get to bully except poets? So how wonderful was that?
So we decided to start equivocating from the stage and competing with the chess club.
What was occurring for the first 6 months or so was that the people were learning their voice. They were finding not their aesthetic voice. Literally, they were learning how to fill up a room. Like, how loud do you need to speak, and how does a person behave on a stage if you want to hold the attention of a large room?
All of a sudden, the original crew weren't there. And the moment they weren't there, everybody else in the cafe, in the community, realized this is not a clique. This is a thing. And that's about the time when I began hosting it. But when the original group of people sort of dissipated, it opened the door for everybody.
It was rapidly growing to the point where I think so this would have been 91, there's like maybe 10 people in the audience or so. By 93 or 94, there was just no space for people in those poetry readings. It was wall-to-wall kids, sitting on the floor, legs crossed, sitting on top of tables, sitting on top of the counter. I mean, it was really full house, fire code violating house.
Poetry Alive was the first thing I stumbled upon on Maryland Parkway. And I was thrilled. I didn't know that you could go to a poetry reading outside of a boring university one. I didn't know that you could sit there like a beatnik and look at other beatniks, and there was this tension and yet this creativity all in one room.
It was an opportunity for people to get stuff off their chest in public with no fear of censorship.
I mean, all it took was to go to a poetry reading, the weekly Poetry Alive reading, and just hear poetry and poems that, among some of which were pretty good.
I had gotten interested in going to poetry readings, and I think that I found the Poetry Alive readings through a listing in the local paper. So I started showing up to that.
I was fresh from women's studies in Utah, and I wanted to apply that to a social group. And I was really excited when I found Cafe Roma. It was transformative. Reading that first poem, people treating me like I belonged there. I wasn't too young, or I wasn't too pretty to be smart. It was also new to me.
There was never this feeling of that there are special people and less special people. It was whoever wanted to read could read, and my impression is that it remained that way pretty much for the life of that reading.
I didn't really get hip to the fact that there was something actually cool happening on Maryland Parkway until probably the end of '92. I'd say it was around that time period that I got turned on to the coffee house scene in Las Vegas. I went to Roma, and I really didn't know what, I didn't know where I was headed. I didn't know what I was walking into. And so I walk in, and I really was sort of overwhelmed by the stimulus. There's paintings on the walls from local artists, and there's flyers from the floor to the ceiling for all of these shows at all of these venues with all of these bands that I've never heard of, and zines, just racks and racks of zines for free, people expressing themselves, artwork and goofy drawings and who knows what, and kids riding skateboards outside on the brick railing, and it was really just this moment of like, oh, here's where everybody's hanging out. This is where this is all happening.
Everybody went to Cafe Roma. Even though there were a lot of other cafes in existence by then, that was really the nerve center of everything. And it just exploded from there.
Just hanging out at the Cafe Espresso Roma is how I started finding out that there's actually stuff going on in Las Vegas that wasn't there before I left.
I would teach a drawing class, say, at UNLV at night. When class was over, I'd go across the street to the cafe and hang out there, watch poetry night or talk to people and so on and so forth before I went home.
It was really informal. There were people that I had really deep philosophical conversations with who I felt that I knew on a really deep level, and I didn't know their name because it was very informal. When you met somebody, you just kind of start talking, and people didn't go, oh, hi, this is Bill, this is John, this is Fred. It was not that. It was just, you just sat down and you'd hear a conversation and you'd pipe in.
For minors, there wasn't much else to do. So they were ending up there, and then they were going, oh, art. I can sit up on the stage and I'll spend the first few times swearing, and then I'll start actually writing.
There wasn't much for people underage to do, under the age of 21. All of the venues where most concerts were happening were 21 and over. And there just wasn't a lot of youth activity going on. So we really had to make up our own kind of a scene.
What kept bringing me back was my fascination with this space. The place itself, the physical place itself, was really intriguing to me, and the people that chose to hang out there, people from all walks of life. And within this environment where art, graphic art, visual art was so profoundly important. The floors were painted, the walls were painted, the ceiling was painted. There's paintings on the walls. There's this mix of things was like, oh, okay, something is happening to me here, and I don't even know how to put words into it, but I'm absolutely going to keep coming back and forcing myself into this environment, even if no one will talk to me. I know I'm supposed to be here because of something that's happening for myself.
There's just a lot happening there, and a lot of people would just kind of hang out there. I mean, you get Anthony Zucker, who went on to create CSI, would hang out at the Roma and write during the day while the different things were going on. I mean, it was just kind of an easy gathering place. It was nice and open space. It was theoretically subterranean, but it got all the natural light. They had a pinball machine there, which I would often be found on. And the coffee wasn't bad, and the people who worked there were cool and weird.
Through my mall job at Sam Goody, I was friends with some guys in a band called Endless Mindless. They were a sports pub fixture. I would go and see them in the Shaken Dominoes. The manager of Endless Mindless was Aaron Britt, who was a tall, dashing self-starter. One night after an Endless Mindless gig, we all went over to Binion's to get steak and eggs. And Aaron asked me if I knew anybody who could write. And I said, well, I wrote for my high school paper. Aaron told me he was starting up a music and lifestyle publication called In Music, was doing it with a guy named Michael Ford, and asked me if I wanted to contribute. They weren't paying anything, but down the line, it was going to become this publishing powerhouse, and of course everybody would get paid then.
It was really the first alternative newspaper that was in Las Vegas. There was also a New Times, I think it came around that same time. So they were competitors. One was a little bit more established. In Music was definitely the renegade one. So I started submitting stuff, little funny poems to In Music, and they were publishing them. So that was actually the first place I was published ever.
Literally the headquarters for In Music magazine was above Cafe Espresso Roma. And one day I met Mike Ford, who was the owner, and Sue Hahn, who was like the managing editor or something. And she's like, oh, you want to write? Well, write us something. And I wrote them something, and they loved it so much I became a steady, I think we were a weekly, we may have been a monthly, column for that. And it got fairly good exposure. I remember one day walking into a record store downtown and seeing one of my columns cut out and pasted on the wall and feeling like I'm a rock star now,
When I was working at What's On, it was a pretty small operation. And I sort of shared a desk with Greg Ryan, who was a local musician as well as a graphic artist. And he and I had started talking about sort of starting a fanzine or starting a magazine about local music scene. And one thing led to another, and the next thing you know, we're actually doing it. We both had a little bit of experience in a successful publishing operation, and there were just some basic operational things, layout and design, that Greg was confident he could make the magazine look better. And in terms of editorial content and sort of being a little more curated and making sure that the articles went somewhere and were edited properly, and fact-checking, and some basic things about, and I'm not trying to imply that In Music didn't do that, but we just felt there were some weaknesses there, that they had no competitor, and that we felt that we could probably come in and do some things. And they were covering a lot more of a mainstream, like they really went out of their way to do a lot of stuff when the Grateful Dead came to town and things like that. And we thought we were going to be, our initial focus was doing more on the underground and alternative arts and culture and music scene. And one of the things that was very interesting about it is you could walk into any of these places all the way up and down Maryland Parkway, whether it be a bar or a cafe or a record store, and there'd be stacks of flyers everywhere for different events and shows. So, going out and just pilfering these flyers to find out about things in the beginning, particularly that we didn't know about, was one of the ways we found stories. And as we started to become more well-known, those people, before they print their flyers, they'd actually call us and say, hey, we're doing this thing, and then we would find a story.
My work within music led directly to Scope. James knew everybody over there, and didn't exactly poach people, but he would let you know that he actually paid for submissions.
James Reza scooped me up from Scope magazine, and I had admired Scope, and James invited me to write for them, and I had a really good time doing that. And there are many well-established writers in this town now and elsewhere nationally that started with James at Scope magazine.
I became an art critic not because I studied art history, but because I was merely a writer. And I came back to Vegas, and there was all this art and this incipient art scene and artists who were now more visible, and no one was writing about them. And so when James Reza at Scope said, what do you want to write about for Scope? Normally, I would have said, I'd like to write about film, because I'm a huge cinephile. But he already had somebody to do film reviews. So I thought, well, you know what? I was at this amazing show at the CAC. It was the Angels show. It was a great show. how come no one's really writing about this? So that's in part also how I became the professor, was here you go, here's my take on Vegas visual arts. And that's what I did for the next 5-6 years.
A lot of the people that I know who work in media actually got their first professional published piece in Scope magazine.
I remember once James was being interviewed for something or other, and he said that Scope didn't just report on the scene, it had to advocate for it.
Particularly the first few years, we were definitely advocates. And because of that, we became like a foil. Like, people had a love-hate relationship with us in the same way I think that we had a love-hate relationship with the culture.
There were things we did in Scope that I would not do with Weekly today. We took a personal stand on a lot of things. You know, we put skin in the game where we had to. We would, sponsor events, or we would hold events just to bring bands out, just to bring people together, just to, have something to do that month. Because there was great stretches back then where nothing was going on. It's not like now where you can find at least 1 or 2 shows a week that you want to go to. We would do a 30-day calendar for Scope, and it was easy to do because there was maybe 2 or 3 music bookings a month at Huntridge, that were worth a damn. And, whatever was happening in the clubs, which was, pretty regular, it was all the same bands playing on the same nights. We tried to help that along wherever we could. I don't know how we did, but we did it.
Virtual radio was an audio collage where I would come up with a topic and then I would find source material around that, or sometimes just riff. I would walk around with my tape recorder and record people saying things and then edit them and put them into the show. So it was always a creative process to figure out a way to do a show and to come up with topics for it. After I became attached to the poetry group, I would invite them to the radio show every week and I would have poets come on and read poetry or just talk. I remember I had different areas of the studio mic'd and wouldn't necessarily tell people when they were on the air.
During the virtual radio years, we would go up there and just be weird freaks on the air for a little time after midnight on Sundays.
Also, there were lots of phone calls and the use of reel-to-reel and 4-tracks and different types of equipment to create sonic landscapes.
I met Doug Jablin, got involved with KUNV, started doing radio with Doug. And Doug had begun doing, right around the time I arrived, he actually did one of the first club virtuals at Benway Bop.
So Club Virtual started at Benway Bop in January of 1993. Initially, it was a poetry group along with a little bit of music.
So people could get up, read poems, play music. It began sort of curated and then sort of became more, hey, open mic. The idea was there would be a house band, people to play music in the background or to do things in between, and whoever had something to read or perform could do so.
At that point, there wasn't any kind of cohesive nature to it. It just was a work in progress. I was trying to figure it out. And I engaged the help of Anthony Bondi and Geoff Morris.
Well, we migrated the show over to the Cafe Rainbow, which was one of those cafes that let us do anything we wanted.
Again, I got Geoff Morris to bring his sound down and asked Tony to come and help out, and he started creating designs for the poetry reading where he would have these huge cut-up billboards and he would staple them to the walls. Tony was really bad that way. He didn't really care about the walls.
I'm thinking to myself, well, we need to transform the environment if we want to encourage the people on the stage and the audience to have a sense of themselves being in someplace different that's not familiar. Therefore, what you see, the production might not be familiar. So I started doing quick, silly sets. We were doing this once a week.
That was the thing that really caught my eye because of the multimedia experience that was happening with that event. Yes, there was poetry, but there was so much more. There was, of course, ubiquitous body painting. Usually somebody was doing some kind of artwork on the walls. It was just such a wonderful and overwhelming mix of every, sights and sounds and smells and all of that stuff. It was really, really incredible.
I learned to be dynamic as Club Virtual came about. I learned how to give a performance. Sometimes people laughed. This felt like building nonsense that we loved. So it wasn't nonsense. It just felt like building nonsense together into something creative and entertaining that drew people together.
I remember there was one time where there was an event going on and we hardly had any poets. So I had a microphone and I walked around the audience with the mic and I interviewed people. And that became the Club Virtual for that evening until the poets started arriving, and then we could start doing poetry. But again, it was the idea of being creative on the spot, like what am I going to do right now because there's nothing going on. But of course there's everything going on if you have people around you.
It just seemed like it was for everybody. Everybody was building. Everybody had a tool or was a building block, or it turned into a house. It turned into this great thing.
Then at the end, we were going to do it every other week, so we had production time. And the first one was my idea, which was Heaven in a Cage, where we put a cage around the poets. Then what was supposed to happen after that was, I think, the virtual homeless show, where we had homeless people, a soup kitchen at Club Virtual. That was Jeff Morris's idea. And
did that happen?
No, that was going to be the week that the next week, and then we just saw that it was closed down. And Jerry was not getting enough people buying coffee, and there was a bunch of footage of me saying, we're all doing this for free, go and buy some coffee. Which is really funny because eventually he went out of business because not a lot of people were buying coffee. A lot of people were coming and hanging out. It was a coffee house where nobody bought any coffee.
And at some point I thought, well, why not, let's do bigger things. We were ambitious, We thought, let's do different kinds of shows. Let's not just do this, let's do all kinds of art projects. Conceptual, performance, whatever. I said to Doug, I was thinking of calling it the Committee for Public Safety, of course, after the famous body of revolutionary terror during the French Revolution, because I thought that was a very amusing and ironic name for it. And Doug said, sure. So myself, Doug Jablin, Jeff Morris, and Tony Bondi formed the core of what became the Committee for Public Safety and began to do art happenings, as it were.
I don't know, Gregory. Am I part of the Committee for Public Safety?
You're on the fucking board.
It just grew organically out of things we were already doing, the radio show, the open mic freeform happenings at the Cafe Rainbow.
Yeah, I viewed every single venue as a possible place to do things. Even at the same time as Rainbow, I was doing things at Benway Bop, over at Cafe Copio.
Cafe Copio was, for a very brief time, in my opinion, kind of the be-all end-all of the coffee house scene for Las Vegas. It exemplified, I think, what could be happening for a coffee house culture for Las Vegas.
Those were a lot of the younger kids hung out. I mean, first of all, it was open later. so that was one of those. It opened later in the afternoon, it was open longer.
Coming from the outside in, the parking lot alone would kind of give you a sense of the mayhem and the incredible crossroads that this coffee house had become.
I'd never seen anything like it. It was just like a bar, everybody knows your name. It was all students, it was all teachers, it was all just a very living room environment. Every time I went there, I just settled in.
Every night was different. You didn't know what was going to happen, whether there was an open mic or just a bunch of dudes playing chess, which happened a lot.
Mike got coffee house culture in a way that we didn't get to experience through Roma. And it wasn't the same vibe as Cafe Rainbow, which was very psychedelic. Cafe Copio, I could see that coffee house existing throughout time. I could see that coffee house existing 800 years ago in Turkey. And it would still have been, you know, freaks and hashish eaters and performing artists and poets, and would have been exactly the same mix of people and races and beliefs. It brought the scene, quote unquote, together in a way that I don't think any other coffee house did.
You would be there just to experience, just to be around it, just to let whatever spontaneous art or happening happen, you know?
I loved Copio. I fell in love there like so many times. There's all these cool kids like doing poetry, art, music, playing chess, dressing funky. It was heaven.
A lot of what we were doing was just kind of creating something on our own out of nothing, out of thin air. Oh, there's a desert? Let's put a show there. You know, oh, there's a coffee house? Let's put a scene there. We didn't just say, let's do it, and then we did it. It just kind of sprouted organically.
It was a great alternative to the bar scene at the time because it was a place you could hang out and be sober or be, you know, blown out on espresso, depending on what it was you wanted to do. But it was a place where people could hear themselves talk and have intellectual discussions and, you know, explore the culture of the moment, you know, and enjoy that.
Cafe Copio was home to some of my all-time favorite shows. And in particular, there was a Someone show that happened there that was just sort of one of those, like, you should have been there for that.
The very first show was at Cafe Copio because what happened was someone was playing that night, and I heard Mike, the owner, there was supposed to be a band or someone canceled, and so I just said, hey, can we play? Like, we can go grab our equipment and be right back. I was like, you know, he's like, well, I don't know, what do you sound like? I'm like, you know, we're mellow, we're like the Smiths, the Cure, we won't be really loud. He's like, okay. I got Jason and Chris, and ran back to my house, grabbed all our equipment, and set up and played, and then Mike asked us back again. Those Copio gigs are what helped us kind of start making more friends in the scene, and like people inviting us on to like play shows with them.
So these coffee houses became kind of the de facto scene for a lot of these bands to get up and get seen and get their tapes sold and get their flyers out. And the coffee house culture wasn't the only place where music was happening, but it was definitely kind of like the headquarters. It was the clubhouse. If you were looking for flyers for shows, you went to the coffee house and then you figured out where you were going to go from there.
You know, you could walk from Cafe Espresso Roma, or you could go upstairs to Sports Pub.
Sports Pub was a sports bar / dance club. It was on the second floor of the promenade. You entered through the back.
Sports Pub started having not a lot of punk bands, but they did enough where it was a place to play, and that was important.
The Huntridge Theater was like a historical theater going all the way back to the middle of the century, and it had morphed into different phases and became a different type of venue. And then it closed for a long time, and then when it reopened, they started having shows there. There were both national and local shows. So it gave a lot of the local bands an opportunity to get exposed.
I got to perform with Jello Biafra in a spoken word show in the Sanctuary, and the Sanctuary was a side room over at the Huntridge on Maryland Parkway.
I heard 9 Inch Nails on Rock Avenue, went to the Benway Bop and got a 9 Inch Nails album, and then like within a month or so went and saw 9 Inch Nails at the Huntridge Theater. I did that for a number of bands.
I mean, I was in local bands that performed in everywhere from, you know, the Huntridge Theater, or played at Cafe Roma. We played at Cafe Copio.
I was in a band called Nature Boy. Around the time that we started to do our thing, I feel like I was seeing a lot of different bands spring up. Solo artists and groups. The goth industrial scene was really starting to pop off, and the noise scene was really starting to pop off, but lots of other stuff was becoming popular at that time as well. When Cyber City Cafe opened, it stretched the scene too thin. Cyber City Cafe had a very different vibe. They were very much like an up-and-coming, new, modern, clean vibe. I think a lot of us maybe didn't feel comfortable there. It also was catering to this new internet thing that everybody was pretty sure was a fad. There was something about Cyber City Cafe that just for the briefest moment seemed to inject a bunch of energy into the scene. and then it sort of like deflated after that, and everybody kind of went off to their corners. There just wasn't enough of us to go around. I think part of the structure and the strength of the scene was that we were all hanging out in this really tiny little space together, and either you were here or you were just across the street over at the other coffee shop. If you were looking for somebody, you know, those were the two places that you would go. And now you had to walk all the way down past Tower, which, you know, in 137-degree heat in Las Vegas actually does kind of feel far. And I feel like it stretched the scene a little thin.
And then let's not even get into what every single cafe owner has always bemoaned, and that is that you can't choose who your consumers are. When you welcome all, you welcome all. And some of those places paid the price for it.
Maryland Parkway, as much as it was thriving, was essentially always going to be the student district. That meant it was going to have to renew itself every 3 years because there goes another grand batch of students. And so if the culture that was developing in the shops was to be enduring, it actually needed to get away from Maryland Parkway. It needed to get into the whole of the city so that it would not be judged or subsidiary to UNLV.
Well, that's the interesting thing, is that there wasn't a huge amount of involvement from UNLV students or faculty. There was some, obviously, there's got to be some overlap. But it wasn't. The Contemporary Arts Collective included people who taught at UNLV, but it also included people who were not affiliated with the university. There were plenty of people who hung out at Cafe Roma who were not college students. But then, of course, there were plenty of people who were college students. I mean, it was right there.
The fact that the Temporary Contemporary was down by UNLV, and a lot of UNLV students came to it because they could walk to it. November 1995 was the last show we had there, and we had figured we had to go somewhere else. And at that time, there was talk about things starting to happen downtown.
One of the things that kept popping up during the 1990s when things were happening was a desire to create an arts district, to create gallery spaces, to create more permanent music spaces than just, you know, random bars.
The Arts Factory was happening then. That was starting to blossom there. And so it was kind of a natural progression. We ended up there.
Out of that move and a number of other smaller cultural activities, the shift of the culture did seem to move more downtown.
The Enigma Cafe really started to establish itself as a destination downtown. And so a lot of people were just sort of avoiding the Maryland Parkway situation altogether to hang out there.
There was no sense as that developed that moving some number of people and culture downtown was going to in any way diminish Maryland Parkway. It looked like Maryland Parkway was going to thrive all by itself forever. And there was only to be the benefit of spreading it out. And so to expand downtown wasn't to diminish Maryland Parkway, it was just to get bigger because that's what things do, you know. And then of course it turned out that was all illusion and not at all so. As Maryland Parkway began to decline, there was the other raft that had already been set free from the mother vessel that could serve as a place to, you know, avoid drowning. You know, if Maryland Parkway is not flourishing, oh my gosh, well now there is downtown.
Unfortunately, KUNV's Rock Avenue was sort of like, you know, cut off at the jugular, and it happened for a variety of different reasons. And one of the reasons was Rob Rosenthal, who was the GM at the time, who kind of shepherded this movement, left the station and moved back to Portland, Maine.
And he was replaced by an acting general manager named Don Fuller. He was one of the jazz DJs. Don Fuller didn't really seem to appreciate the diverse programming that we were offering there, not to the extent that we had it.
The Edge came on the air, which is a commercial alternative radio station, for whatever that's worth.
But all they would do is they just cherry pick the stuff off of Rock Avenue, the stuff that was the big hits, and then all the interesting stuff was left off their playlist.
Alternative culture just started to rise, and you know, I'm not looking down at KEDG at all, the Edge at all, because with the rise of the Edge came the rise of Scope Magazine. I mean, the fact that alternative culture made it out of the underground and into the mainstream is really what propelled us to be able to keep going on this tiny little shoestring budget for as long as we did.
So in 1997, at some point, the acting general manager, Don Fuller, hired a program director, a professional program director from the local NPR station. And he started making some changes around the station. One of the biggest changes was canceling out the morning Rock Avenue programming and replacing it with smooth jazz.
KUNV and its new general manager started to see that the mission was sort of gone. The general manager had been gone, and there was other ways to reach the community. They were trying to be a more community-oriented radio station and feed the community other alternative sounds like what happened to be at the moment jazz that wasn't being heard anywhere else.
After a while, we started kind of seeing that things were happening, like the staff wasn't getting new membership cards anymore. Ron Benway was joking, yeah, because he's going to fire all of you, and I thought that was so cynical. Why would he? He's not going to do that. He would have done that by now, you know. But sure enough, a few months later, on May 18th, 1998, I woke up and there was a voicemail on my answering machine from the music director at the time, and he told me one of the most horrible pieces of news I ever heard, that Don Fuller had canceled all of the rock programming from KUNV, but he got rid of the Rock Avenue, he got rid of Radio Lucent, which was the other show I was involved in, and the Still Hour, and Audio Apocalypse, and the Speed Zone, and Brain Pain. And he kept very little of the non-jazz format there.
You know, maybe it was what the donors wanted, and I still don't know why he did it, but there was a great sadness that day.
And it just felt like a big thing was taken away from us in the scene. We lost a way to promote our shows. We lost a way to introduce each other to new music. We lost a way to promote our bands.
You absolutely could turn on KUNV, and once an hour there would be somebody that, talking as fast as they could, would rattle off every single local show that was happening, regardless of what it was or where, you know, if it was in the desert or at Fuddy Duddy's or whatever, like somebody was, you know, going to list your show.
And that really made an impact, I think, on us especially, but on the underground, on Tower Records. That was pretty much the kids. That's where they heard all the new music.
Where did you get new music at that time? Because The Edge was fine, but it was still a commercial radio station, so it was still the same rotation of the same top 50 or whatever alternative charts there were.
It was just the same old shit all the time. Every song you've always ever heard that you're still hearing right now. KUNV played all the bands I loved, bands I never knew existed, and like taught me so much.
I think it was devastating to the culture of Las Vegas. It no longer was there the ability to hear these individual kind of voices. Like I don't know that it became more corporate, but it definitely there wasn't that platform anymore.
I felt like things were radically changing in the scene. Benway had closed once and possibly closed again by that point, and the first time that Benway Bop closed, it really seemed to take a lot of air out of the scene.
We got to like a roof in Vegas, we felt like. We were here a long time. We were here 9.5 years. We got to a roof where we knew everybody who walked through the door. Kelly's from Los Angeles area. She always wanted to go back. I can't lie. I wanted to go back too. This is my hometown. I don't claim to love it here.
We closed the store in Las Vegas because our children were getting older, and they wanted to go to college, and one of them expressed interest in marine biology in Las Vegas.
So we closed Vegas, moved to Venice. We opened the morning that U2 Pop comes out, the electronic U2 record. We're selling punk rock. We close our record store in Vegas, and we take this stock to Venice Beach. And we put a punk rock record store, Las Vegas Punk Rock Record Store, in Venice Beach. And we open the door, the first 30 people in the door go, where's U2 Pop? I want to try you guys out. We were like, you don't have it. I think by noon I was in a car driving across Los Angeles to get a box of them. So a few months goes by, and we're not doing so well in Venice Beach, where we're both from, where we both worked for another independent record store for years. And we both decide, like, maybe we should have a fallback. Maybe we should go back to Vegas and have a fallback in Vegas and be ready to run from Venice Beach.
So we said, you know what, we can still open a store in Las Vegas. We can, in the same center we did it. So we opened that store, we hired some great people that we knew for a very long time.
We came back and there was no Rock Avenue. We saw it change so quickly when Rock Avenue went down. That was our billboard. That was our advertising spot.
There was no place for these kids to hear, you know, Bikini Kill or Butt Trumpet or anything on K Records, Relativity, anything. Really, it was very sad to close that store. Because we went back up there because we missed it. We missed the people, and at least we could go up there every other week and know that we were making a difference. And Rock Avenue just kind of squashed that. It was sad.
There was something about that record store closing that was sort of this like trumpet blast off in the distance, and you could start to feel like rumbling under your feet that things were beginning to change.
I was in school in Los Angeles and would make it back on the weekends pretty frequently, but it was never like a deliberate trip to go to Balcony Lights or the cafes, although they were always something that I would frequent when I was back.
I mean, it seemed like it was pretty vibrant. It seemed like a lot of things were happening, and you know, it seemed like it would kind of happen forever. I didn't think like anything was amiss.
The thing to remember is that the 90s was the huge boom town period for Las Vegas. After the Mirage opened, all of that boom time on the Strip began. That was a real sort of Rubicon. We crossed over from things have been sort of stable in the 70s, 80s to now everything is changing. Those of us who were sort of interested in having more arts and cultural offerings thought, well, that's great. As the city explodes, the number of people who are going to be into the arts is going to explode with it. Many people would come to Vegas who might be interested in that, would realize it was not going to be Portland, it was not going to be Seattle, it wasn't even going to be Los Angeles, and they would leave.
For all that we were doing and being creative, all the time there were conversations where people were like, I want to get out of Vegas, I want to get out of Vegas, I want to get out of Vegas. Like that was always an underlying theme, even though we were there like doing this thing. And I was definitely one of those people who's like, I can't stay here forever.
I guess you're looking at a lot of your mainstays and people you would have depended on business for, showing up less and less, but we saw it. And even when I was in town, I even created kind of a Cold War era propaganda campaign, graphic design, flyer set, trying to get this idea for people to save Roma because it was in danger, as all those places were.
In Vegas, something fails, and then you're just without it until somebody else comes along. Really, the death knell for Maryland Parkway as being that was the closure of Cafe Roma. There was no coffee house equivalent to that until the Beat opened a few years later. I mean, everybody wound up at the Coffee Bean and Tea Leaf across from the university.
Copio, I think in that December of 2000, had its unfortunate fate. There was somebody who broke into the spot who had been angry about being 86th and put a can of gasoline on one side and a pipe bomb on the other. And the explosion didn't actually do anything but destroy part of the windows in the front, but it was the water damage that killed the place. That beautiful wooden bar and the stage and all of that. And so with the death of Copio and what was looking like the closure of all of those different spaces on Maryland Parkway, it became really apparent that it was up to us to do something about it. And we're kids. We didn't know what to do, Posters was about all I could offer.
The problem in general with cafe culture is that it's very hard to make it a profitable venture and maintain a sense of community, communal standards within it. Either you're a business that sells coffee or you're a place people hang out.
I left in 95, and I went back in 96 and 97, and it seemed like the community was still going strong. There was still all kinds of things happening. And then I went back again in the year 2000, and it was like a wasteland. Everything was shut down. The Copio wasn't there anymore. The sports pub wasn't there anymore. Cafe Espresso Roma wasn't there anymore. It just felt like it just all went away. It was really a sad moment when I went Just walked up and down Maryland Parkway, and it was almost like it went back to the way it was before the scene was there.
You know, the record stores and the venues, you know, kind of found their footing again. You know, not long after Benway and, you know, and Balcony Lights and a lot of those guys closed up was Big B's, which carried the torch for a while. The cafes never quite came back.
As technology grew and it became easier to be friends online and have this social network that really wasn't there, the real social network suffered as a result.
The internet is the new Maryland Parkway.
The present challenge is that social media creates communities and drives people to spend all their time at home reading social media. And so to physically step out of my space into a public space with the intent of carrying on face-to-face conversations with other people becomes ever more intimidating.
I'm not sure how the newsroom would possibly have survived in this day as I watch people in the various local and international coffee houses around here. They're not meant to be putting people together.
And it's strange to me that things didn't, like when those businesses kind of faltered, that other businesses didn't come in and take over because the clientele was there. Like, it was already in motion. So, I mean, it could have been still successful if other people had stepped up. You know, now there's really nothing. When I go by Maryland Parkway, there's no foot traffic there. There's no, like, energy there that used to be there.
Even the sort of corporate landscape of that stretch of Maryland Parkway, like the Pizza Hut, the Wendy's, the Carl's Jr., where generations of UNLV students, you know, sat and, you know, did their homework. All that stuff's gone too.
There's one or two stragglers, you know, like Alternate Reality Comics is still there.
I've always wanted my store to be near UNLV, but over the years, it's just Maryland Parkway it has lost what character it did have.
Part of the reason for going to Maryland Parkway was you could go to Cafe Roma, you could swing down to Tower Records, go across to Payman's, and you're always going to run into somebody that you know. There's always going to be something going on. You can find something going on, and I think that particular energy has definitely shifted to downtown.
Downtown took pretty much anything that was going to happen in Maryland, where most of that started, is now downtown.
It feels stuck right now, and I can't figure out why. I can't think of the last new place that opened out down there that I wanted to go to. Even the places that opened up after the fact, that opened up after the boom, like Freakin' Frog was one of them. There was a Coffee Bean and Tea Leaf for a hot minute that was very popular, and those are gone as well. It was like a wave wiped clean all of the local Vegas, all of the independent Vegas that had taken root. You know, it could be that UNLV is still, largely a commuter school. It could be that their student union is pretty pimped out. I know they've got a lot of restaurants in there.
You know, they took the coffee shops and moved them into the student union, which is a great idea. I want to hang out and have coffee while I'm studying. Well, why should I walk across that horrible, gigantic, Berlin Wall of Maryland Parkway to go to an independent? Why don't I just stay there? And so they do.
The university has more students than it ever has, and they're building more on-campus or near-campus housing. A lot of that's happening right now.
With the university, yeah, they're busy and they're growing and expanding, but this area, it's just heartbreaking that so many businesses around me now and businesses across the street, they either come and go or they just close. They're just a storefront now.
A lot of the business and neighborhoods, they're just people, they have this perception. It's not to be too harsh about it, but really run down. I mean, the homeless problem has just gotten,
There's a dense homeless population, service resistant is the word. People that are really in harm's way are out there. There's mental illness that is rampant, and the services for those folks are limited.
There is a decline to that area. However, having been a resident of Las Vegas for 30 years, I've seen this cyclical nature. I believe that Maryland Parkway is actually kind of up and coming now. There's an area on Maryland Parkway called Paradise Palms that's become a fairly popular place to habitat. And there's a number of things that are starting to come back. There are developments, there are new bars, there are new restaurants, and we'll see, we'll see.
Everything I learned and saw and was exposed to in the early 90s on Maryland Parkway had a direct connection to every step I've taken since in regards to music and my career and my passions and where I spend my time, spend my money. I look around my house and I see things that I either bought back then or would have if I could have afforded it then, and now I can and did. And it's exciting to know that I found something early in life that was so influential that has guided me ever since.
You know, that whole scene, you know, there are people who are gone, but they all in their way like informed who I am today. And I really am thankful to everybody along the way, you know, who was there, because it was that community's open arms that took a lost kid like me in and helped me grow, you know? It really did. All the experiences, for better or worse, they're all in me and still with me and a part of my life. And I'm super grateful and thankful that all that happened and that I was able to discover that, because it was a very, very magical time and a very, very magical place.
I met some of the best friends in my life there, honestly. Friends that will be my friends forever.
The 90s for me were really, really special. There weren't a lot of barriers, at least that I could see. And it was a very, very magical time.
It was one of the most creative times in Las Vegas. I really think that the rest of the country missed something.
And I think that the artists that recognized that time for being what it was, the Tony Bondis of the world, the Joyce Strausses, the David Figlers, and all these people who realized that they were on the bubble of something special, that they got to be at the ground floor of this movement.
The ability to be a part of that, to push out culture into a town where arguably the culture was extremely narrow and focused on things that didn't speak to hardly anybody I knew. To be able to be a part of that and part of the history, it's something I'm still proud of to this day.
I grew substantially, dramatically as an artist and as a poet and as a creative person. And I would not be who I am, doing what I'm doing, if I had not experienced those few years in Las Vegas the way that I had with that group of people.
It was just wonderful to have my own space, to be weird. Because I was always told in Vegas not to be weird. Like, I grew up here being told, like, hey, don't be so mork for mork, sit down and don't be so crazy. And
It was the 90s. I mean, it seemed like everything was okay in the 90s. You just sort of grooved along in the 90s in a way with each other, especially where we all were. You know, we had all these activities and opportunities and places to go, and everybody didn't get along, but it was a diverse group of people. There were so many people.
There were all these different like subgroups within this scene that were like kind of crossing over and mixing and mashing, and in some way it all created this cool confluence of creativity, of people just trying to make things happen and trying to express themselves.
I think one of the things that I remember when I think back on that time is just the comfort I felt, you know, being in that collection of people, and in that kind of diverse array of like people that were very lofty and cool, and others that were more approachable. It was a collection of misfits, and it was very comforting to be in the fold with those people, even if, you know, a lot of times I barely knew the names of some of these people, you know.
I miss it. I miss the marble tabletops at Roma, and I miss the comfy couches at Copio, and I miss the weirdness of Rainbow, where it was really uncomfortable when you walked in there.
I mean, that whole scene of the 90s was really kind of like a cultural primordial stew for a lot of people who went on to do other things in media or in music or in arts. It feels like nostalgia to look back and go, wow, we did something pretty amazing, but the fact is that there's actual evidence that some really great things came out of that period.
Well, I mean, there were a lot of people who went on to great things. I mean, you know, we saw our friends in the Killers get very famous. The first Killer show I ever saw was at Cafe Roma. I know Ronnie Vannucci used to go to the poetry nights, not as a poet, but he was just kicking around that scene because that was kind of the scene that was going on.
And we weren't thinking, you know, we're going to create a movement or this is a movement. It was more like, oh man, let's make this thing. Let's do a performance piece. Let's just get together and listen to music. That was kind of special. And I'd love to create something like that again.
Maryland Parkway was one of the best parts of my whole life. It changed everything for me. It changed everything. I don't think I've said that enough times, that it was my springboard, and Maryland Parkway was magical.
You know, was it special? Was there something incredible happening there? Was there something really unique happening there? I think to an extent we look back and we romanticize it. I think we romanticized it then. But yes, I do think something very special and very unique was happening in that environment, partly because we didn't have the luxury of living in a larger city where these scenes were already established by generations of freaks and weirdos and bohemians and beatniks before us. There was very little in the way of fringe or alternative or underground in Las Vegas. And even in its heyday, it was incredibly small. So we kind of had to go to everyone's show and be at every event, because otherwise it was, you know, you and your 5 friends hanging out on the couch. Like you had to be involved in all of the different scenes and check out all the different bands. And that lended an incredible strength because everybody knew about everything. Everybody hung out everywhere because there wasn't really anywhere else to go. But there was also a real power and a magic to it because we were the inventors of this. We weren't inheriting this scene from a previous generation. We were building it. We were birthing it. We were the folks that were deciding what it was going to look like and how long it would last.